Imagine waking up to find a horse frozen in your yard, not just any horse, but a wild Mustang, one of the last of its kind. What started as a rescue mission in the middle of a brutal winter storm would lead to shocking discoveries that no one could have predicted. The man who found him thought he was just saving an animal, but what he uncovered about the Mustang's past would change everything. Stick around to see what happens when a connection between man and beast reveals secrets that will leave you speechless. Jake Sullivan had always been a solitary man, content to live out his days in the rugged mountains of Wyoming. A rancher at heart, he had spent years working alone, taming cattle and raising horses. The quiet solitude suited him. No city distractions, no noise, just the raw, untamed beauty of the land. That is, until the morning of the unexpected visit. It was an unusually cold day. The wind howled through the trees, and snowflakes danced in the air as the first light of dawn touched the ground. Jake was out checking the fences, making sure everything was intact after the storm, when something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree or some animal, but as he walked closer, his heart skipped a beat. There, lying motionless in the snow, was a wild Mustang, frozen and unconscious. Jake's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just any horse. The Mustang was majestic, with a golden brown coat covered in a layer of ice, its body lying still against the snow-covered ground. The sight was enough to make any man stop in his tracks. This was a wild creature, one of the last of its kind, a horse that had seen and survived the harsh wilderness of the American West. For a moment, Jake stood frozen himself, unsure of what to do. But then instinct kicked in. He had always been one to help animals in need, and this horse was no different. He couldn't just let it die out here in the cold. His heart raced as he hurried over, assessing the situation. The horse's eyes were closed, and it was breathing, but just barely. Its chest heaved weakly, the sound barely audible over the wind. The wild Mustang had been caught in the blizzard, and by the looks of it, it had been out here for hours. Jake wasted no time. He pulled the Mustang to its feet with all his strength, carefully dragging the animal across the snow toward his barn. Every step was a struggle, but he wasn't about to leave the horse out in the storm to die. The Mustang, though large and powerful, was as fragile as a newborn at this moment, unable to help itself. Once inside the barn, Jake quickly got to work. He grabbed blankets and anything he could find to keep the Mustang warm. He set up a small space in the corner of the barn, laying down the blankets and covering the horse's body. The wind howled outside, but in the barn, it was warmer. Still not ideal, but enough for now. Jake worked tirelessly, his rough hands moving with practiced efficiency as he tried to revive the Mustang. The animal shivered in his care, its paws cold to the touch, its body stiff from the cold. It wasn't easy. Jake had seen many animals go through hardships, but this felt different. This Mustang had the look of a fighter, someone who had survived against the odds. Jake wasn't sure if he would make it through the night, but he wasn't ready to give up. Hours passed, and the Mustang's condition seemed to improve. It wasn't sure if it was the warmth or the food, but something seemed to stir within the wild animal. It was a small sign of hope, a flicker of life in its eyes. Jake didn't want to get his hopes up, but he felt the pull of something deeper. He had been around horses his whole life, but this was different. There was a quiet strength in the Mustang, a connection that seemed to bond them despite the circumstances. As the evening wore on, Jake sat on a stool by the stall, watching the horse closely. The barn was quiet, the only sound the faint breathing of the Mustang and the occasional creak of the building, settling in the cold night. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the Mustang's eyes opened slowly, cautiously. The wild animal began to look around. It was as if it had just woken from a long, deep sleep, its gaze sharp and focused. It stared at Jake for a long moment, its dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that took Jake by surprise. For the first time, Jake felt a shiver run down his spine, not from the cold, but from something else, a connection, something almost unspoken between them. Jake didn't speak at first, but after a few moments, he said softly, "You're not out of the woods yet, but we'll get you through this." It was the only promise he could make, and the Mustang, despite its wild nature, seemed to understand. Jake spent the next few days keeping a close eye on the Mustang. Every morning, he would check the horse's condition, ensuring it was eating and drinking enough to regain its strength. He was cautious with his approach, never too close, never too far. He had worked with horses for years, but there was something about this one that was different. The Mustang had a wild, untamable spirit that seemed to hold a depth beyond what Jake could understand. The Mustang's breathing had slowed, and the ice that had once covered its coat began to melt away. Its body, although still frail, was showing signs of life. Jake carefully treated the horse's legs, rubbing them to ensure the blood flow returned. He'd done this before for other animals, but it felt different with this horse. He couldn't explain it, but there was a connection that he couldn't deny. The Mustang's gaze never left him, even when it was too weak to stand. Jake couldn't help but feel like the animal was silently assessing him, as though it were trying to figure out whether or not it could trust him. In return, Jake found himself more determined to help the Mustang. The wild animal wasn't just a victim of the storm. It was a survivor, just like Jake. In the evenings, Jake would talk to the Mustang as he worked. His voice was soft and calm, as if trying to build a bridge between them. "You're tough. I can see that," Jake would say. "You've made it this far. Don't give up now." And every evening, he would see a slight improvement. The Mustang, now a little stronger each day, would stand on its own for a few moments, shaking off the weakness in its legs. It wasn't much, but it was progress. It would paw the ground once or twice as if trying to shake off the remnants of the storm. After 3 days, the Mustang finally stood fully on its own. Its body was still shaky, but its spirit was beginning to return. Jake was cautious, knowing that the animal still needed time to fully recover, but there was no denying that they had made it through the worst. One afternoon, Jake decided to take a chance. He slowly walked into the barn, holding out a bucket of oats. He had seen the Mustang eat small amounts of hay, but this would be different. This would be the first time the Mustang would get close, enough to eat out of his hand. The Mustang, sensing the food, slowly walked toward Jake. It hesitated for a moment, eyeing him with that same cautious, calculating look. Then, after a few seconds, it lowered its head and took a small bite from the bucket. Jake didn't move, not wanting to scare it. He kept his hand steady, keeping the oats just within reach, letting the Mustang come to him on its terms. Jake held his breath. This was a small victory, but to him, it meant everything. The Mustang had chosen to trust him, even if it was just for a few moments. "That's it," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible, one step at a time. In the days that followed, the Mustang began to improve rapidly. It became more responsive, its once dull eyes beginning to shine with life again, and its muscles, although still weak, starting to regain some strength. Jake had always known horses were resilient, but this Mustang was something else. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jake noticed something different. The Mustang had stood up from its resting spot, and instead of retreating into the back corner of the stall as it usually did, it walked toward the door. Jake stood frozen, watching as the horse approached him, its head held high, its eyes no longer fearful. It was as if the Mustang was beginning to understand the world around it. Again, no longer lost and cold, but alive and thriving. "You're getting there," Jake said quietly, a smile creeping onto his face. The Mustang's body language had changed. It was no longer just a wild animal recovering, but a creature beginning to reclaim its sense of self and purpose. As the days passed, the bond between Jake and the Mustang continued to grow. With each passing day, Jake couldn't help but wonder what had happened to this horse before, how it had survived so much, and why it had ended up in his care. But for now, the only thing that mattered was that the Mustang was alive, and Jake had a part in bringing it back to life. As the days turned into weeks, Jake found himself growing more and more attached to the wild Mustang. It wasn't just because the horse had survived the storm, nor because it had taken refuge in his barn. It was something deeper, something that Jake couldn't quite explain. The bond between them was palpable, and it grew stronger each day. The Mustang had regained most of its strength, but there was something more to the animal now. It wasn't just a horse, it had become a companion, a presence that Jake could no longer imagine his days without. The Mustang, although wild at heart, had come to trust Jake in a way that no other animal on his ranch ever had. And Jake, in turn, had started to understand the Mustang in a way that went beyond mere survival. Jake spent hours in the barn, sitting on a hay bale, simply watching the horse as it moved around. Sometimes it would stand still, its head held high, eyes scanning the horizon as if it were searching for something just out of reach. Other times, it would pace in circles, as if trying to shake off the restlessness that had taken root deep within its bones. But no matter what the Mustang did, it never went far from Jake. It had become accustomed to his presence, and it seemed to understand that the man was part of its new world. One morning, Jake decided to test something he had been considering for a while. He had seen the Mustang grow increasingly confident, but there was still something wild about its spirit. It wasn't ready to be fully tamed, but Jake had a feeling that it was ready for the next step. He walked into the barn with a rope, his movements slow and deliberate. He knew that forcing the Mustang wouldn't work. He had to approach it with patience. The last thing he wanted to do was push the animal too hard. Jake had spent too many years with horses to know that the best way to gain their trust was by moving at their pace, not his. The Mustang lifted its head at the sound of Jake's footsteps. It watched him closely, its dark eyes following every movement. Jake stopped a few feet away, giving the horse the space it needed to decide whether or not it wanted to engage. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. There was a silence between them, one that was filled with a quiet understanding. After a few minutes, the Mustang took a tentative step toward Jake. It stopped short, its muscles tense, but it didn't pull away. Jake held out his hand, palm open, not expecting the horse to come any closer, but simply offering a gesture of trust. The Mustang's ears flicked forward, and for a brief moment, Jake thought it would back off. But then it took another step. "Easy now," Jake whispered, his voice calm and steady. The Mustang paused again, then stepped forward, gently nudging Jake's hand with its nose. A soft exhale escaped its nostrils, and Jake felt a warmth spread through him. It was the first real sign of trust. The Mustang was allowing him to touch it, to be a part of its world. Jake slowly ran his fingers along the horse's neck, feeling the smoothness of its coat under his hand. The horse didn't flinch, it simply stood there, accepting the contact. Over the next few days, Jake spent more time working with the Mustang. He began to introduce more tasks, leading it from one side of the barn to the other, encouraging it to follow his steps. It was a delicate process, one that required patience and time. Slowly but surely, the Mustang began to respond to Jake's touch. It wasn't just the horse's physical strength that was returning. It was its confidence, its ability to trust. But despite this progress, there was something in the Mustang's eyes that Jake couldn't ignore. Even as it became more comfortable with Jake, there was a restlessness deep within it, something that spoke of a life lived beyond the walls of Jake's ranch. The Mustang had a wild heart, one that couldn't be contained for long. Jake could feel it, the urge to run free, to feel the wind beneath its hooves. One evening, as Jake watched the Mustang pacing around the barn, he realized that it wasn't just the animal that needed to heal. It was he, too. The Mustang's presence had done something to him that he hadn't expected. He had spent so many years alone, living a life of solitude. But now, with the Mustang by his side, he felt less isolated. There was a connection between them that went beyond the physical. It was a bond that neither could explain, but both could feel. They were two survivors, one from the wild and one from his battles, and together they were starting to heal. Jake didn't know what the future held for him and the Mustang, but one thing was certain: they were in this together now. The days turned to weeks, and with each passing day, Jake found himself becoming more attached to the wild Mustang. It wasn't just the physical recovery that mattered. It was the way the Mustang had begun to understand him and the way Jake had come to understand the Mustang. Jake had spent so much of his life working alone, and though he had always cared for his animals, this Mustang was different. Storm, as Jake had come to call the horse, wasn't just any wild animal. It was as if the spirit of the land itself had found a way to speak through the horse. It wasn't just about the Mustang's survival anymore. It was about the bond they had forged, one built on trust, patience, and the quiet understanding of two beings who had been left to survive in a harsh world. One chilly evening, Jake decided to take Storm out of the barn. The weather had cleared, and the air was crisp with the scent of pine and snow. The sky was a deep purple as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. And Storm had regained his strength, and Jake knew it was time to begin testing his limits. The Mustang had become accustomed to being around Jake, but there was still an undeniable wildness in him, an urge to run, to be free. Jake understood that he couldn't hold Storm back forever. In a way, the Mustang had become a part of Jake's life, but the opposite was true as well. Jake had come to realize that he, too, was a part of Storm's journey. The horse didn't belong to him, it was the other way around. Jake walked slowly toward Storm, who stood in the center of the corral, looking out toward the mountains that bordered the ranch. The wildness in the Mustang's gaze was unmistakable, the same yearning to run that had brought him to Jake's doorstep in the first place. "Are you ready for this?" Jake murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Storm's ears flicked back toward him, and for a moment, it seemed like the horse was considering his words. Then, without warning, Storm took off, galloping through the corral with a force that sent a spray of dirt into the air. The wind picked up as Storm ran, his hooves pounding the earth in rhythmic beats, his body a blur of power and grace. Jake couldn't help but stand there, watching in awe as the Mustang raced across the field. Something was mesmerizing about the way Storm moved, as if every stride was a declaration of freedom, of a life lived on his terms. Jake didn't chase him. Instead, he stood at the edge of the corral, his eyes locked on the Mustang. He didn't need to do anything. Storm had made his choice. He was a wild horse at heart, and no matter how much Jake cared for him, Storm would always belong to the wild. After a few minutes, Storm slowed, his breath heavy, his body covered in sweat. He circled back around to Jake, stopping just a few feet away, his dark eyes filled with something that almost looked like satisfaction. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and Jake felt a deep understanding pass between them. The Mustang had run free, but he had returned not because he was commanded to, but because there was something about Jake that he trusted. Jake didn't move. He let the Mustang approach him, his heart still racing from the excitement of watching the animal run. Storm nickered softly, his head low, and his body relaxed as he came closer. Jake reached out slowly, brushing his hand against the Mustang's coat. The horse didn't pull away. Instead, he stood still, allowing Jake to run his fingers through the thick hair along his neck. For a moment, it felt as though everything had fallen into place, man and Mustang, two beings connected by something beyond explanation. But even as the horse stood beside him, Jake couldn't ignore the ache he felt deep inside. He knew this connection wasn't going to last forever. Storm was wild. He was free. And no matter how much Jake wanted to keep him, he knew that this life, this moment, was fleeting. The wildness in the Mustang's soul would never truly be tamed. "You'll always be free," Jake said softly, almost to himself. "That's the way it should be." For a moment, it seemed like Storm understood. The Mustang nudged Jake's shoulder gently, then turned, trotting back toward the wide-open space beyond the corral. Jake watched him go, a mixture of sadness and pride welling up in his chest. He had known from the beginning that Storm wasn't just an animal to be tamed. He was a creature who had seen the wild, who had known the freedom of the open plains, and who would never forget that life. As Storm disappeared into the distance, Jake stood there for a long time, alone with the setting sun. The Mustang had chosen his path, and Jake had to let him go. But Jake was at peace with that. He had given the Mustang the chance to live again, and in return, he had learned something about himself. At that moment, Jake knew that sometimes love meant letting go. Jake had always lived a quiet life on his ranch, the days flowing by in a routine of hard work and solitude. But ever since Storm had come into his life, something had shifted inside him. There was a part of Jake that had always felt disconnected from the world around him, lost in his quiet existence. But with Storm, there was an undeniable link, a bond that went beyond mere survival. The Mustang's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. Storm had regained his strength quickly, moving with a grace that was reminiscent of the wild horses Jake had heard about in stories. And yet, despite the horse's progress, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Storm's past than what he'd been told. Something about the Mustang's eyes, the quiet intelligence they held, seemed to suggest there was a story, a history that went beyond the horse's mere survival. One evening, after a long day of work, Jake sat on the porch of his ranch house. The last light of the day cast long shadows across the snow-covered ground. He looked over at the barn where Storm stood, his head held high, gazing toward the mountains that lay beyond the ranch. Jake could sense the Mustang's restlessness. It was as if the animal was searching for something, some part of himself that was missing. It was then that Jake decided to do something he had been avoiding. He needed answers. He couldn't ignore the feeling that Storm wasn't just any Mustang, that there was something about this horse's past that had led him to this point. Jake drove into town the next morning, the roads slick with ice and snow. The town was small nothing, more than a few buildings and a general store, but Jake knew that. The old-timers there often knew more than anyone cared to admit. If anyone knew anything about Storm's past, it was them. He walked into the local diner, the warm smell of coffee and bacon filling the air. As Jake sat down at the counter, the waitress, an older woman with graying hair, greeted him with a smile. "Jake Sullivan, hub," she said, her eyes scanning his face. "You're the one who took in that Mustang, right?" Jake nodded. "I found him in the storm, frozen to the ground. Took him in, got him back on his feet." The waitress looked at him with a knowing expression, as though she were seeing through him into something deeper. "You don't know the whole story, do you?" Jake paused, unsure of how to respond. He had never asked the horse any questions. He had only taken him in and cared for him. But there was something in the waitress's voice that made him feel as though Storm's story was not just his to tell. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, his voice low. She leaned in, lowering her voice as though she were telling a secret about that Mustang you found. "He's not just any horse. He's from a wild herd that roams the mountains up north. You see, the government's been rounding up the Mustangs for years, trying to control their numbers, trying to tame them." But Storm, she trailed off, shaking her head. Storm was one of the last ones left. They tried to break him, tried to take him away from the land. But he kept escaping. Jake's heart raced. "What happened to him?" The waitress sighed, looking over her shoulder before leaning in closer. "He was part of a group that they tried to capture. They did everything they could to tame them. But some of those horses are not meant to be controlled. Storm got away, but there are rumors that he's been marked, that he's part of something bigger. Some say he's the last of a bloodline that was bred to be untamed, to be free. He's been hiding out in the mountains for years." But now she looked at him, her eyes serious. "Now he's here with you, and I don't know if that's good or bad." Jake's mind raced with the new information. Storm was more than just a horse. He was a survivor, a symbol of something much larger, something that Jake hadn't even begun to understand. But one thing was clear. Storm wasn't just a wild animal who had wandered into Jake's life by chance. As Jake drove back to the ranch, the weight of the waitress's words settled on his shoulders. Storm was a wild creature, one that had been shaped by forces outside of his control. The Mustang wasn't just lost, he was a symbol of freedom, of a life that couldn't be contained. And Jake had unknowingly become part of that story. Storm's journey had only just begun, and Jake knew that his own would be forever changed. The connection between man and beast had always been there, but now it was something deeper. They were both survivors, brought together by fate, and the road ahead would be filled with questions, ones that neither of them was ready to face. But for now, Jake had a role to play, to let Storm heal, to give him the chance to be free, and to see where that path led. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet tension. Jake had been living with Storm for months now, and the connection between them had only deepened. The Mustang had become a regular part of Jake's life, not just as an animal under his care, but as a presence, one that demanded respect and understanding. But the more Jake learned about Storm's past, the more he realized that there were secrets still hidden, not just in the Mustang's past, but in the land itself. One evening, after a long day of working the ranch, Jake sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The ranch was silent. save for the rustling of the trees in the wind. Storm was grazing in the field, his golden-brown coat glowing in the fading light. Jake's mind wandered back to the conversation he had with the waitress in town. The story of Storm's wild bloodline, the bloodline of a horse who couldn't be broken, couldn't be tamed, stayed with him. It nagged at him like a memory that refused to fade. That night, as the moon rose high, Jake made a decision. He would head into the mountains. He had always heard the stories, the legends of the wild herds that roamed the foothills, living free and untamed. Storm came from that world, and Jake needed to see it for himself. He had to know more about the Mustang's origins, about the life Storm had left behind before he came to the ranch. Jake knew the risks. The mountains weren't easy to navigate, especially in the middle of winter. The terrain was rough, and the weather was unpredictable. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Storm was calling him, that the answers lay hidden somewhere in the vast, untouched wilderness. He saddled up one of his older horses, a sturdy gelding named Bear, and set out before dawn. The sky was gray, the mountains looming in the distance like silent sentinels waiting. Jake had no real plan. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he had to see it, had to understand it. The wildness, the spirit that Storm had brought into his life, needed to be understood. Jake wasn't sure if he could explain it, but there was something inside him that said the answer would lie in the mountains. As he rode, the snow crunched beneath Bear's hooves, and the cold wind bit at his face. But Jake didn't mind. The ride was long and tiring, but the quiet beauty of the land helped clear his mind. As the hours passed, Jake found himself nearing the edge of the forest where the wild herds of Mustangs were rumored to roam. It wasn't until the sun was beginning to set that he saw them, a small group of wild Mustangs. Their coats, a mixture of grays and browns, appeared at the edge of the clearing. Jake's heart raced. He stopped Bear, holding him steady as he watched the horses. There was no mistaking it. They were Storm's kin, a part of the same herd that Storm had come from. The wildness in their eyes was unmistakable, their bodies lean and strong, and their movements were fluid, like the wind itself. Jake watched them for hours, studying their behavior and their freedom. He could feel the energy in the air, the untamed nature of these animals. They were not just survivors. They were warriors, living as they had for generations. They roamed freely, unbothered by the world of humans. Jake could see it now, the deep connection between Storm and the wild world from which he had come. It was clear that Storm had been part of something much larger than Jake could have imagined. He had come from a line of wild horses that had faced adversity, that had been hunted, and yet still carried the spirit of freedom. The horses in the clearing moved with an elegance that came from being born into this world, a world that Jake could never truly understand. As the night grew darker, Jake reluctantly turned Bear around. He knew the time had come to head back to the ranch. He didn't have all the answers, but he understood something fundamental now. Storm wasn't just a horse who had wandered into his life. He was part of something bigger, something ancient and untamed. Jake rode back in silence, the weight of his journey settling in his chest. He had come to the mountains to find answers, and although he didn't have them all, he felt like he had uncovered the truth about Storm. He was wild, he was free, and he was never meant to be tamed. By the time Jake arrived back at the ranch, the stars were bright in the night sky. He made his way to the barn, where Storm was waiting. The Mustang stood in the center of the stall, his eyes watching Jake with an intensity that spoke volumes. It was as if the horse knew that Jake had found what he had been looking for. A silent understanding passed between them, and for the first time, Jake knew exactly what he had to do. The decision had been made. Jake knew that he couldn't keep Storm at the ranch forever. The Mustang had given him something that no other animal ever had: a sense of freedom, a reminder of what it truly meant to live without boundaries. Storm wasn't meant to be a pet or an animal to be tamed. He was meant to run wild, to be free, in the land where he truly belonged. Jake had spent countless days thinking about this moment. The quiet connection between them had been special, but Jake could feel the restlessness inside Storm, the longing for the open plains, for the wind in his mane, and the freedom of the wild. It was a call Jake understood, one he couldn't ignore. That morning, after a night of snowfall, the ranch looked beautiful. The white blanket covered the world outside like a canvas untouched. Jake saddled up bare, his old gelding, and walked toward the barn where Storm stood, his eyes bright with anticipation. It was as though the Mustang knew this moment was coming, that he was about to be set free. Storm had recovered not just physically, but mentally. The wildness that had been dormant within him now burned brightly. He was stronger, more confident, and ready to return to the mountains where he had once roamed. Jake stood for a moment, looking at the horse that had changed his life. Storm wasn't just an animal. He had become a symbol of everything Jake had been missing, a reminder of what it meant to live freely, without restrictions, without fear. Jake approached the Mustang slowly, the soft snow crunching beneath his boots. He reached out to touch Storm's neck, feeling the familiar warmth of his coat. For a moment, neither of them moved. There was no need for words, just a quiet understanding. "You're free." "Storm," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "This is your home, your life. I'm just here to help you live it." Storm nickered softly, his ears flicking back in recognition. He lowered his head and nudged Jake's hand as if thanking him for the care he had given. Jake smiled softly and gently brushed his fingers through the Mustang's mane, savoring the moment. This wasn't goodbye, it was simply a new beginning for them both. As Jake led Storm to the open field, he felt a deep sense of peace. The Mustang was ready. He could feel it in the way Storm moved, the way he carried himself with each step. The wildness in the horse seemed to awaken, his body moving with an energy that Jake couldn't help but admire. This was a creature that had survived against all odds, and now he was going back to where he belonged. "Go on," Jake said softly, giving the Mustang a final nudge. Without hesitation, Storm broke into a full gallop, his hooves pounding the earth, his body a blur of motion and power. Jake stood frozen for a moment, watching as the Mustang tore across the open field, heading toward the distant mountains. He ran with the wind, his mane flying behind him, his body moving with a fluidity that spoke of pure freedom. Jake watched until Storm was a mere speck on the horizon, disappearing into the wilderness where he would once again be part of the wild herds, part of the land he had come from. Jake knew that the Mustang would never truly be his, but he was glad to have been part of its journey. As Jake stood there, the sound of Storm's gallop slowly fading into the distance, he felt a sense of release, of freedom, not just for the Mustang, but for himself as well. For the first time in a long time, Jake understood what it meant to let go, to set something free. He had given Storm a chance at life, a chance to be the horse he was meant to be, and in doing so, Jake had found a kind of peace that had eluded him for years. He turned back toward the ranch, his heart light, his steps steady. There was no more uncertainty. Jake had learned something valuable, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. True freedom can never be forced. It has to be earned, and it must always be respected. As he walked back toward the barn, Jake knew that even though Storm had left, the Mustang would always be a part of him, just as he would always be a part of the wild heart that ran free in the mountains. Jake's journey with Storm was more than just a rescue. It was a reminder of the power of freedom and the bond between man and animal. As Storm ran free into the wild, Jake realized that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is the freedom to be who we truly are. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a little inspiration today. Let's continue to celebrate the wild spirit within us all.